Well, good morning. I am a white guy, and the symbolism of that is not lost on me today as we enter this time and as I speak on this date. And because of that, most of the words you hear today will not be mine. I'm going to be sharing the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, and it's my hope that I can just briefly frame those words and give them some meaning for us gathered here today and those watching online. As you heard me mention earlier, on June 19th, 1865, federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas to declare the emancipation of all Americans, of every slave being freed. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued 2.5 years earlier by President Lincoln, but as a result of the geographic fractures created by the war, many strongholds of institutionalized racism still existed. Texas was the final area of this nation to surrender to this particular bend of the arc of the moral universe toward racial justice, and someone had to forcefully bring the news that these people had refused to come to terms with. The war was over. So 59 years later, from the Birmingham jail where he was imprisoned as a participant in nonviolent demonstrations against segregation, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a letter that was a response to a public statement of concern and caution issued by white religious leaders in the South. Excuse me. So here are some of the words of Dr. King from the Birmingham jail. While confined here in Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling our present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom, if ever, do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would be engaged in little else in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. I think I should give the reason for my being in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the argument of outsiders coming in. Think about these words right now. Think about the criticisms Dr. King received. Think about the present day. He goes on, I have had the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliate organizations all across the South, one being the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Whenever necessary and possible, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, one of our local affiliates here in Birmingham invited us to be on call to engage in a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promises. So I am here along with several members of my staff because we were invited here. I'm here because I have basic organizational ties here. Beyond this, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with a narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider. You deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham. I'm sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. I'm sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes. I would not hesitate to say that it is unfortunate that so-called demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham at this time. But I would say in more emphatic terms that it is even more unfortunate that the white power structure of this city left the Negro community with no other alternative. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. I want to repeat that. I just referred to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, he goes on, but I must confess that I'm not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, non-violent tension that is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need of having non-violent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men to rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So the purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. We therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in the tragic attempt to live in monologue rather than in dialogue. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups are more immoral than individuals. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given to the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I've never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well-timed according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. It has been a tranquilizing thalidomide, relieving the emotional stress for a moment, only to give birth to an ill-formed infant of frustration. We must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited more than 340 years for our God-given and constitutional rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward the goal of political independence, and we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward the gaining of a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smoldering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has been advertised on television. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living constantly at tiptoe stance, never knowing what to expect and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into an abyss of an injustice, when they experience the bleakness of corroding despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. It is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just, and any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and that it itself is willing to follow. This is sameness made legal. I must make two honest confessions with you, my Christian brothers and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill. Hear this. Shallow understanding from the people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. In your statement, you asserted that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But can this assertion be logically made? Isn't this like condemning the robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical delvings precipitated the misguided popular mind to make him drink the hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique godlike consciousness, and never-ceasing devotion to his will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion. We must come to see, as federal courts have consistently affirmed, that it is immoral to urge an individual to withdraw his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest precipitates violence. Society must not protect the robbed to punish the robber. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. All that is said here grows out of a tragic misconception of time. It is the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. I am coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. I want to say that again. I'm coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. Dr. King went on in his letter to make some exceptions about certain leaders in the church who he thought were affirming equality, but he says, despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who has nurtured it in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. I had the strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I have been disappointed. I have heard numerous religious leaders of the South call upon their worshipers to comply with a desegregation decision because it is the law, but I have longed to hear white ministers say, follow this decree because integration is morally right and the Negro is your brother. Dr. King finishes his letter by saying these words. Over the last few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. So I have tried to make it clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. I wish you had commended the Negro demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of the most inhuman provocation. One day the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths, courageously and with a majestic sense of purpose, facing jeering and hostile mobs and the agonizing loneliness that characterizing the life of the pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women symbolized in a 72-year-old woman of Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride the segregated buses and respond to one who inquired about her tiredness with ungrammatical profundity. My feet is tired, but my soul is rested. They will be young high school and college students, young ministers of the gospel, and a host of their elders courageously and nonviolently sitting in church counters and willingly going to jail for conscience sake. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in the Judeo-Christian heritage. Never before have I written this long a letter, or should I say book. I'm afraid it's much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else is there to do when you are alone for days in the dull monotony of a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers? If I have said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth, and it is indicative of an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything in this letter that is an overstatement of the truth, as indicative of my having a patience that makes me patient with anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King, Jr. 59 years after this letter was written, has much changed? Do we live in a nation that looks and operates very differently? We wake up in a nation, friends, where Juneteenth and MLK Day are both national holidays, and yet where an entire political party is working incessantly to prevent teachers from teaching that the decades of ugliness that precipitated the civil rights movement even existed. All the slaves and prisoners in America are not yet emancipated. 150 years following the last holdouts of the Confederacy facing the reality of the war ending, and 59 years after Dr. King's letter lamenting white resistance to progress, our shared sickness remains today. The symptoms of this slavery and imprisonment are apparent in the disparity in the rates of incarceration between white people and people of color, in the disparity in pay for equal work, in the disproportionate accessibility to health care and education and voting rights and affordable housing, in the lack of people of color in positions of power and leadership, in the lopsided history of police brutality, in historic generational poverty. But these truths are not the slavery and imprisonment that most afflict this nation today. Our greatest collective ailment is not a literal confinement or physical imprisonment. It is the white supremacy, privilege, and resistance to equality within the hearts and minds of so many white Americans that is still hindering humanity. The conscious and subconscious prejudices permeating us. We've seen it in the response to the murder of George Floyd. We see it in the gerrymandering and voter suppression efforts of the Republican Party. We see it in the white supremacy embodied in the MAGA movement. And as Dr. King grieved in Birmingham, we can still find it in the lukewarm response of so many professed progressive white people in the face of it all. Whether due to fatigue or laziness or fear or aversion to conflict, human beings who wouldn't advocate for slavery or intentionally perpetuate systemic racism or celebrate police brutality or wave Confederate flags still enable it all by our silence and inaction and intentional distractions. Bob Marley once sang, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery," and we in white America, who want to imagine ourselves anti-racist, need to embrace this invitation in the core of our beings. The internal servitude of our countrymen and women is being aided by people like us who would rather keep an uneasy peace in our families and our marriages and churches and workplaces and social circles than enter into the fray of honest conversations about race. 157 years after the events of Juneteenth, I think white America needs to work for the emancipated minds of so many white Americans, for freeing the people from the fear and bigotry and selfishness and greed and hatred that still perpetuate racism and inequity and injustice. And because of that, you and I, we need to march into the fortified strongholds of racism, to the last holdouts of inequality, to our homes and neighborhoods and schools and churches, and then to the polls and declare that all people are not yet free and all people deserve to be free. We need to release white Americans from bad theology, predatory politics, lack of information, unconfronted privilege that maintain the sickening status quo, because until this happens, the cancer of racism will remain, and slavery will not be in our regrettable past, but in our grievous present and in our disfigured future. People of color can be legally free, but until more white Americans are emotionally, intellectually, and mentally emancipated from prejudice and privilege, we will still be here 157 years from now fighting over the value of a black life. So many people we know and love are still trapped in James Baldwin, I want to read this quote before I finish. James Baldwin says, "They are, white people, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years and for innumerable reasons that black men are inferior to white men. Many of them indeed know better, but as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know." This nation doesn't need more ceremonial holidays. We need more courageous Caucasian people who will invite discomfort and sustain bruises and welcome turbulence and risk relational separation from our tribes of affinity and our communities of origin, for the sake of disparate humanity in a time of urgency that is no less urgent than when those words were spoken by Dr. King or when those troops marched into Galveston. The fight against racism is not the fight of people of color alone. We who are white moderates or progressives or liberals or simply decent human beings, we need to be more vocal in our anti-racism and more willing to be disobedient to laws and accepted norms and popular movements that are inherently racist. We have to risk the kind of relational and social tension that Dr. King described in his letter, the kind that millions of others have willingly engaged in the cause of equality. And what does this mean? It means that more white Americans need to confront those they know, love, worship, and work alongside, those they live with and socialize with the ugliness of who we are and have been. 157 years after Juneteenth, there are still barricaded holdouts to ratified prejudice who need to hear that all people deserve to be free. And we need to lovingly but loudly bring that message to those still waging a war inside their heads that desperately needs to end. We are not free until we are all free.